university now, I have been included in many discussions about assessment, what it is, what it looks like, how it varies from class to class, paired with the fact that this semester we were in a classroom for 3 weeks straight where we were responsible for assessing during that time. I've learned some new things that you can really only learn by practicing instead of just being taught. But yeah, I'll start in right with my initial assessment philosophy. Throughout university, we've been told things about what assessment is, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what I believed or that's what I had seen in my own experiences. Through my own experiences, initially I would have believed that assessment varies by subject. In an English class, you're writing essays, but you don't get a test. In math, you're working with worksheets and tests. So all of those forms of assessment are specific to the class that it relates to. This was my experience throughout all of school. Through high school, my idea of assessment was whatever you had a grade on. It was only summative. It was, at the end of the day, assessment was, do I make the honor roll or not? Do I pass the class or not? If it's science, because science I'm not strong in. And it was an idea that then assessment and evaluation are the same things, which we've learned in this class. That's not the case. Furthermore, in high school, assessment was something that the teacher had total control over. If the teacher told you had to do a speech and got a grade on it, that was what you had to do. And that it's this negative idea that school is just doing what your teachers tell you to do, and that's what learning is. Newer teachers in my high school, I reflect a lot on my grade 12 year, specifically because I had an older teacher who was about to retire the next year, who was the type of teacher who wrote notes on the board and we copied it down. I also had some newer teachers who had only been teaching for a few years in that grade, specifically in English class, and he incorporated choice, which now that I've been in university for 4 years, I realized the value for choice. And those were the forms of assessment that I became passionate and motivated about. I guess, long story short, my assessment philosophies come from my entire schooling years, but it was in my later years I can now recognize how some of my teachers were implementing strategic assessment skills. From there, I get into this question of what is assessment. And right from our very first class in ECS 410, we were discussing what assessment really is in relation to evaluation. And we had a lot of interesting conversations in groups about what that is, specifically to formative versus summative assessment, which is something that you hear a lot in university. But again, it's not until you implement it in practice that you really understand the separation between the two. There's an article that we read in class called Assessment as a Tool for Learning, which describes assessment as a constructivist approach to education, basically in which learning is viewed as a process through which the learner creates meaning. So this is more than just a test that you are filling out, because the learner isn't creating meaning through giving the right answers. People don't realize that there's a difference between learning and gaining knowledge and actually constructing meaning. And as this article suggests, that's what assessment really is. It's evaluating how the learner creates meaning, not just that they were able to retain the knowledge. There are varying forms of assessment too, but they should all strive to challenge students to activate the knowledge and skills that they have learned. Assessment shouldn't be limited to just what specific classrooms need. As an English major, we're always encouraged to implement writing in every subject, even math. Like, how can you develop those writing skills, these basic skills that so many high schoolers now don't have because they didn't learn it in elementary school. As teachers who want to collaborate, and our classes should collaborate and work together to construct meaning continually, not just, we shouldn't be dividing up these different class cultures. They all come together to create this community where we're constantly learning. And then furthermore, into this idea of summative and formative assessment, they both work to inform both the teacher and the student about learning, and they allow the student then to conceptualize their own knowledge and skills. And I'll get into that a little bit later too. Formative assessment may not have a grade, and how many times do students say, oh, well, is this for marks? And as soon as it's not, they don't care about it because they've been trained to believe that summative assessment is the only form of assessment that matters. The term assessment is automatically scary for students, when really they should be able to use formative assessment to really understand their own knowledge. And that level of communication through assessment actually truly tells them what they do know and what they can work on. As I mentioned before, this class really paired well with the pre-internship experience, which has caused me to fully analyze formative and summative assessment. As a student, I can relate, and I understand the misconception about the importance of formative assessment. However, as a teacher, I recognize the value, especially as a teacher who taught for 3 weeks during this term, and in such a short time, you really need to assess the growth that these students have made, that they are comprehending the knowledge and rereading text. So how do we assess that they are understanding this text so that in the end they can meet the desired outcome? My assumptions about formative assessment as a student were unnecessary. It was just more work. It was pointless. So then as a teacher, how do I connect with the student over this? It's difficult to explain to students why something might be important, especially if they don't care, they don't want to respond. So I think it really comes down to building those relationships, to building forms of assessments that students can understand. And so in class, we discussed various epistemologies defining assessment in the classrooms, and there is some overlap. If we're looking at constructivist epistemologies or positivist epistemologies, oftentimes we can just label them as one being very traditional and completely wrong, and one being very progressive, and that's all we should do. And I've come to this conclusion where there should be some sort of balance. There's an article we read in class by Patricia Hinchy, and it literally asks us to rethink what we know. And it's become increasingly clear that we, as new teachers, often rely on what we've seen and what we know. We were all taught with traditional views, and so it's easy to sit and discuss, how can we do things differently? What can we do different? Why should we be different? But then as soon as you walk into that classroom, we want to rely on what we know and what we know will work. Whether that's the most effective form of working, that's debatable. But because we know it and we feel more comfortable and familiar with that, it relieves some of the stress that we have going into teaching. So then looking into disrupting initial assumptions going forward, this class talked about how traditional assessment techniques fall under a positivist approach to learning. So transferring knowledge to students and asking them to transfer their learning back to the teacher for assessment, usually in the form of a test, which we discuss. Whereas the constructivist approach to design experiences that will give students an opportunity to develop their own understanding of the data at hand. So we as teachers need to ask students to engage in deeper level thinking. It doesn't matter the class, it doesn't matter the outcome. We need to change the forms of assessment so we can push students into that. We talked in class about Christopher Emdin, who presents this idea of reality pedagogy, and immediately this term reality, it separates teachers from considering idealistic scenarios and causes them to think about the reality of students. I feel as if a lot of university hasn't prepared me for the actual classroom because we spend a lot of time thinking idealistically and thinking about how we can change things and make things better. And I love that, and that is great, but it's baby steps. And as soon as I walk in the classroom and I look around and I talk to people and I realize that this isn't the reality. The reality isn't that I can walk in and break the wheel, so to say. The reality is I have to learn and grow along with the students. Just like we should ask our students to put their learning in practice, so should we. So if content isn't the most important thing, we need to practice that as teachers. We need to practice meeting the students where they're at, according to the reality of the lives that they live. And this means actually practicing the alternative assessments. Even if it's scary or even if it's different from our predecessors, we have to take the risk and we have to practice it and be prepared that if it fails, that's okay. And as teachers, we're allowed to fail and still garner respect from students and learn from our mistakes. And I believe that's really the only way that we can enter this new age where we step away from the traditional forms of assessment. So then, using the understanding by design template, teachers should always begin with their desired outcome. We decide first and foremost, what is the outcome? What questions do we need to ask of our students? We need to make this the student-friendly connection to the curriculum, make students aware of what it is that they're learning, and ask essential questions that relate to the desired outcome. And then from there, we decide on how to assess. What do students need to be able to do to meet the outcome? How do they exhibit an understanding of the outcome? More often than not, we ask them to just write something because it's in the curriculum or because students can just explain what they mean. If they just explain that they understand, usually through writing, then we can assess on that. And there are cross-curricular competencies that we can implement to find new ways for students to explain their understanding, find various alternative assessments. For example, Ann Davies had an article presented in the class that specifically points out the need for students to be able to communicate. Sometimes that might look like writing, but for me too, as a student, I recognize that communicating with others often helps me form my own thoughts and opinions. So that's why discussion is so important. Maybe there's a way that we can use vocal communication as a form of assessment. So some of the non-traditional forms of assessment I've seen and do want to try, I stole a couple from my pre-internship experience. One teacher was doing a unit on satire, and she got her students to make memes. Another Hamlet character comprehension assignment I saw was choosing characters and making a dating profile for them. So I guess it's just these specific assignments that relate to students and relate to the reality of the students' lives. Memes are a part of their culture, so let's use that in the classroom, which Emden kind of talks about a little bit, about bringing in the outside culture into the classroom so that the school isn't a separate building from their real life. They're not two separate worlds, they're conjoined in one. And then by doing these fun forms of assessment, the students themselves have fun and they are able to exhibit an understanding. Furthermore, this idea of allowing for choice. I didn't always have this freedom as a student, but when I did in my later years, I learned significantly better. And 5 years later, I can say, this is what I learned in this class because I chose to learn that, because I formulated meaning out of this content for myself. Ann Davies' article also goes into implementing an audience, which I think is very, very interesting. So it ties in that level of communication again. It gives students a purpose for their assignment, to be able to communicate their work and communicate that they've achieved that outcome and receive feedback from others, whether that's peers, older students, teachers, staff, parents. You're not just handing in something that no one but the teacher sees and then gives you a grade. Project-based learning, again, we've talked a lot about in this class, and this can be scary for students, but it really ensures that the student finds meaning for themselves. I think in that sense, the teacher has more work put out for them as a facilitator and as a guide, but it's good for the students to be able to come up with that own meaning. And then, again, this idea of using technology to its full advantage. The times have changed, so should we. It's so easy to hand out paper graphic organizers that you just found online. But how can we use technology maybe to do the same thing? And this idea of communicating online, we don't necessarily need to be writing out thoughts or presenting with a presentation board behind us. How can we use online technology to still communicate meaning? The issue then comes with the barriers that we might face doing that. Students don't always appreciate alternative forms of assessment. We as humans, we don't really like change. I really do think that the biggest barrier comes from the students themselves. And I saw this in my pre-internship experience. They don't want to try new things that seem daunting or unorthodox. They want to hold on to what they've always known, just like we as teachers want to hold on to things we've always known, even though it doesn't benefit anyone. They don't want to think critically because they've never been asked to do that before. That's a lot of work. What I believe now is different from my initial philosophy. For example, assessment is about more than grading assignments and placing a number in a grade book. The learning outcome should always be at the forefront of the assessment. That comes first and the assessment comes afterwards, and you're providing feedback throughout, which was provided in one of our articles that we discussed in class. Assessing is for the teacher. It's not just for the students. It's for the teacher to know what works. It's for them to find out what doesn't work, what needs to be altered, if students are really learning. And as society and culture changes, so should learning and teaching change. In practice, assessment tells the teacher what they need to work on. For example, in my pre-internship, I got my students to do a quick write where they just had to write their thoughts about the book. I told them just write straight for 3 minutes. What do you think? What confuses you? Do you like it? Do you not like it? Tell me why. Just write your thoughts and be open and honest about it. And from there, I figured out what students were struggling with. And then I used the class to specifically discuss those tricky concepts with them. And that was a new concept to me as well, that my faculty advisor introduced to me, this idea of pre and post assessment. It's not just your overall formative or summative assessment. How are you using post assessment or pre assessment to affect your next lesson? So yeah, it was interesting to learn new things, especially just by practicing it. But yeah, my assessment philosophy has changed quite a bit over the course of my university years, and I believe it'll change even more as I go into full internship and see how they grow and change, and how I will continue to grow and change.